The United States has made it clear that Europe will not have a seat at the table for Ukraine peace talks. Donald Trump's Ukraine envoy, Kellogg, says Washington will act as an intermediary, with Moscow and Kiev as the key players. So, how has Europe reacted to being sidelined? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, emergency talks over the future of Ukraine have been held in Paris after a move by the US to freeze Europe out of peace negotiations. French President Emmanuel Macron invited a select group of European leaders to discuss the continent's role in an eventual ceasefire in Ukraine and to redefine its security strategy.
A crisis meeting in Paris. The key focus? More defense spending and a long-term security plan for Ukraine. The leaders of Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, Denmark, and the UK were invited. Those absent were countries with close links to Moscow, such as Hungary and Slovakia. The meeting, a response to America's peace talks with Russia.
There should be no decisions on Ukraine without Ukraine, and no decisions on the security of Europe without Europe.
At stake is not just the future of Ukraine, it is an existential question for Europe as a whole, and therefore vital for Britain's national interest.
The move by US President Donald Trump to initiate talks with Russia without Ukraine's direct involvement has angered Kiev.
You could talk about anything, but no decision can be made without Ukraine on how to end the war in Ukraine. We were not invited to this meeting, the US-Russia meeting in Saudi Arabia. It was a surprise for us as well as for many.
The meeting between US and Russian officials in Riyadh has paved the way for broader high-level talks.
Today is the first step of a long and difficult journey, but an important one. And President Trump is committed to bringing an end to this conflict, and as he said when he campaigned for president. And he wants it to end in a way that's fair. He wants it to end in a way that's sustainable and enduring, not that leads to another conflict in 2 to 3 years.
The talks have deepened a growing transatlantic rift, with the US also pushing Europe over defense spending. Europe is facing increasing pressure to stand on its own. Will it rise to challenge? And can they help broker and implement peace in Ukraine?
Well, let's meet our guests. Sean Bell is a former Air Vice-Marshal and military analyst. Adam Boulton is the esteemed British political journalist and broadcaster. And in Pennsylvania in the United States, Michael Ryan. He is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. In Minneapolis in the US, we have Amy Koch. She is Republican strategist and former Russian linguist for the US Air Force. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Adam, I'll come to you first. This is the biggest security crisis in Europe since, 1945? And Europe looks like being sidelined.
Well, I think we've had one or two security crises before, fall of the Berlin Wall, the Balkans and the rest of it, but certainly this is a major one. And Europeans have been shocked. That's why we had the emergency meeting in Paris. It's why it's likely there's going to be another meeting on Monday involving Zelensky and other European leaders, because, in bluntest terms, at this stage, they have been left out by the United States and Russia, a country where most of Europe still has sanctions and is opposed to. They have got together and said, we can sort out Ukraine without consulting you, or at least that's the first message. Now, you've got a long history. People remember Yalta, where Churchill was sidelined by Stalin and Roosevelt, and we ended up there with the Iron Curtain coming down across Europe. So clearly it is a very worrying moment. That said, I personally am a bit more optimistic. I don't think that the United States and Russia will be able to reach an acceptable peace deal on their own or be able to enforce it. But it is certainly a wake-up call for Europe that the interests of an America First America no longer really align with the interests of Western Europe.
And Sean, all of this at a time when there are many fractures and divisions amongst Europe's leadership.
I think Europe for many years, for decades, has assumed a level of responsibility of America for their security. President Trump, when he first came into office, was very clear that NATO is a very powerful organization, but if you don't pay your dues, then you can't really expect to live under the umbrella of defense that NATO provides. And then 2/3 of the NATO nations weren't paying their way. He's come back into office. There's still a third of NATO nations not paying their way. And a lot of Europeans, frankly, are living under that umbrella of security without paying for it. And I think all of a sudden, President Trump's very vocal criticism saying, look, we're going to focus on China. This war is on the European continent. It's on your back door. You need to step up to the plate. And all of a sudden, I think that's caused a lot of European nations a degree of panic as to work out what on earth they're going to do.
Let's get the American perspective. Amy, to you first. How much of this is about saving US tax dollars, and how much of this is about Donald Trump winning a Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah, I don't think it's about either of those things. I really and truly believe that Trump has been, he's been very vocal. First of all, this is classic Trump negotiation. He goes in hard, sort of shock and awe, and then he negotiates to where he would like to be. And so politically, I'm kind of surprised Europe didn't see this coming. He's been talking about NATO, and he's been talking about exactly what we were just saying, that still a third of so-called NATO allies don't pay the floor on their own military protection. And so, his vision is, if you want to be at the table, if you want to be a true ally, then be a true ally. And I think that he carries the sentiment of a great many Americans. We want to be and recognize the importance of our allies at NATO, but we need true allies. We need true partners. And if not, then we will go it alone. And that is, I think, what he's saying. I also think that, and we can probably get into this, but I have great confidence in Secretary of State Marco Rubio understanding fully what he's getting into with the Russians. And it isn't as though they are our friends, but we are willing to go into negotiations with whomever we need to bring about peace.
Michael, what's Trump's game plan? What do you think is going on here?
Well, thank you for the question. I agree with what Amy said, but we have to remember there is no process at present. This is the first step in a very long process. We just had the NATO Defense Ministerial. Secretary Hegseth was there. Secretary of State Rubio and the Vice President were both in Munich. The Vice President met with President Zelensky. President Trump, after he talked to President Putin, called President Zelensky. And so there's a very engaged effort, but we have to start somewhere. And the relationship between the United States and Russia is geostrategic. There are many other moves in play. China is considered the pacing threat in the United States. In many ways, Americans see China the way Europeans see Russia at present. And so we have to balance all of these factors, including Iran and North Korea and the situation in Africa and everything else that's going on. President Trump genuinely wants to end the killing, and that's where we're starting. The Europeans will come in places and at times where it's necessary, but it's not going to be one big meeting room with everybody around the table. There'll be bilateral meetings, multilateral meetings. There'll be U.S. meetings with allies at NATO, with the European Union. And this is going to be a very long and difficult process. And so I think the goal, though, is peace. We got to remember what we've been doing hasn't been working. All the numbers are moving in the wrong direction vis-a-vis the potential for victory by Ukraine, and therefore the dynamic has to be adjusted in the favor of the Western allies.
Adam, to you, what did you make of Keir Starmer offering to put British boots on the ground as peacekeepers in Ukraine?
I think that was a very significant move by Keir Starmer, coming from a left-of-centre politician. But the question will be whether he is prepared to put his money where his mouth is, to actually give the military the wherewithal to be part of a significant presence. And frankly, we've had very similar noises from the French as well. Equally, people who have not been necessarily funding their military. However, I would push back on one thing about this. What is absent from Donald Trump's approach so far is any sense of values. In other words, neither Vance, when he was at the Munich Security Conference, nor the president have dwelt on the fact that this was unprovoked aggression, bloody aggression by an authoritarian state. And there are many suspicions, I have to say, across the political spectrum in Westminster, with the exception of the far right, who are identifying with Trump, who, seriously think that to cozy up to Russia and to talk about getting a back payment of $500 billion worth of rare earth minerals from the Ukraine is seriously offensive and morally defective. And this is a problem that is going to have to be overcome. And of course, the Europeans need to put their money where their mouth is. But, there is a serious question as to whether the whole approach which this administration has taken, combined with the insults, frankly, that, the kind of Zhejiang vice president made in Munich, whether this is the correct way of going about achieving peace at all.
Sean, to you, you've spent a lot of time in Ukraine over the last few years. How will they be feeling now, given that they're not at the table, they're not involved in the conversation, and their very future is up for grabs?
Yeah, I can't speak for Ukrainians particularly. The one thing I would say is that when you talk to them about ending the war, and I respect Michael's view. Everybody wants the war to come to an end, but this war wasn't started 3 years ago. It wasn't started in 2014. When you speak to Ukrainians, it started 300 years ago, and they've just seen the former Soviet Union and Russia just keep at them. They've tried to destroy their culture, the language, the people. And therefore, they're not going to accept a little signature or a drug deal done between nations that have nothing to do with Ukraine. And actually, I think it would be unfair to tarnish the Americans. I don't think Donald Trump's trying to do a deal with Russia. I think what he's trying to do is create a framework within which there is the potential for some sort of deal to be done. And my worry is that the political short-termism tends to try to put a bit of a sticky plaster over it. But I think, like President Trump has made similar sort of outrageous announcements about Gaza. But what I admire is the fact that if you simply just stop the fighting, you don't solve the problem, and it will erupt again in the future. And I think what we're seeing, which is a fresh approach by President Trump, at least going, how do we tackle the root causes of this? Because otherwise, if we just stop today, Ukraine believes Russia will just come at it again in a few years' time.
Amy, talk to me about Donald Trump welcoming Vladimir Putin back into the fold. I mean, he's been a pariah for years now, and your president has offered the hand of friendship, it would appear.
Well, he certainly has reached out and had a call, but he also additionally had a call with President Zelensky. I do believe he's trying to set this framework. I do believe he's trying to sort of, kind of wake up our European allies to what he would like. I'm also want to get back to, I'm very confident with Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the table. He is fully aware. His family comes from Cuba. He's fully aware of what exactly Russian projection and aggression around the world has meant. And I very much trust him at a table to know that while we can have these talks and we can shake things up, that we must go with great caution, particularly when it comes to the likes of Vladimir Putin.
Michael, on that point, can Vladimir Putin be trusted?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So I'd like to say that I agree with Sean, and I want to take issue with something Adam said, respectfully so. Europe has enriched the Russian war machine by relying on Russian oil and gas for decades. And so comparisons about who's getting rich from whom, I think, are inappropriate and not helpful. When it comes to Putin, he has a long plan. He's been in power for 25 years, and he's still trying to reset what happened to the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So he's going to continue, and everyone knows that. Everyone knows he started the war. Everyone knows Ukraine is fighting for its survival. Again, President Trump wants the war to stop. And as Sean helpfully said, of all, we have to create a relationship between the United States and Russia where they're talking. Recall President Trump talked to the leader of North Korea in Singapore. So he's willing to do that, but he's not going to give away the store in the process because, again, everybody knows President Putin is completely untrustworthy.
Adam, I was in Davos a couple of weeks ago and I was lucky enough to hear Zelensky speak in person, and he made the point, it was interesting use of language. He said, for us, there is no ocean between Europe and Russia. And he was making the point that he believes Putin will keep going until he's stopped. And it's all right for the United States being the other side of the Atlantic. But the point I'm making, Putin, I mean, will he feel emboldened now that Trump has reached out to him so quickly and a 90-minute phone call?
Well, as we've been hearing, I don't think it's a given necessarily that there will be this big man agreement between Putin and Trump on how to settle the war. It may well be that once they start talking to each other, one president decides that what the other president wants is unacceptable to them. So I don't think we should go to the top. And therefore, I think that the role of Keir Starmer talking constantly about the link between America and peace settlement and Europe, I think that could potentially be helpful, particularly since Keir Starmer and his team are going to be in Washington. But I think the overall impression at the moment is that the Europeans do feel that they have an investment in the future of their continent, and they do feel that, and Ukraine certainly has an investment in its future, and that is being disregarded. And I don't think it's necessarily a brilliant negotiating strategy, not least because you can draw analogies with Yalta and Roosevelt and Stalin sidelining Churchill. Difference, of course, is that Russia is nowhere near as strong as the Soviet Union was back then. And it appears that Trump is prepared to make considerable concessions, letting Russia back into the international community in spite of its many violations, including poisoning the Skripals and the rest of it, to give away the chance of ever extending a security umbrella to Ukraine by not allowing it to join NATO, and only being able to articulate, and the administration has done this, territorial concessions by Ukraine to Russia. Now, all of that is what has set red lights flashing. And I don't think that the United States is in as powerful a position as Roosevelt was in 1945 either, which is why I think that in a sense, the premise that this is all going to be sorted out at that level is a mistake.
Sean, from a military perspective, do you think Putin has done his sums and realized that his economy is being heavily impacted by 3 years of full-scale war in Ukraine and it's time to step back?
It's very difficult to get inside President Putin's mind. I mean, there's lots of analysts working their way through that, and it's very, very difficult. What I would say is that I'm slightly more positive about the US approach about this initial negotiation. If you go back, I'm just old enough that when the former Soviet Union wanted to put missiles on the southern border of the US, it triggered a Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, very nearly went to nuclear war because the US was so aggravated about that. So to now, 60 years later, if Russia's worried about NATO being on its doorstep, it's not an unreasonable conversation to have with between President Trump and President Putin about the future of NATO, and likewise territory being ceded. Trump is a seasoned negotiator. He won't be playing a hand he doesn't need to. But even President Zelensky, at most recent interviews, was somewhat pragmatic about the fact he saw it was unrealistic to get those territories back, and he was more focused on actually how do you secure the territorial integrity of the rest of the country that's there. There's no doubt President Putin's economy has suffered. The casualty rates have been amazing. They've lost a lot of kit and equipment. And actually, from a military perspective, we were more worried about Russia's military capability and threat to Europe 3 years ago than we are now. They've been proven to be relatively incompetent. But the fact remains, Putin now needs an exit ramp somewhere. And I suspect that the challenge, of course, is how do you guarantee security and sovereignty for Ukraine, and also try not to look to reward Putin for his aggression, a really difficult nut to crack.
Amy, to you, is there a feeling in the United States that the Ukraine situation is just draining resources and people have grown tired of hearing about it on your news headlines and asking the question about why the United States should be sending billions and billions of dollars constantly?
No, I think Americans are fully prepared to put up the resources and the manpower and whatever else is needed to ensure, peace across the world. What we are frustrated with is a plan that has not been working, where the numbers have been going in the wrong direction. And so when we see that, I think there is tremendous support for an approach from an administration that is willing to do something different, to try another way. And as I said, while we greatly value our NATO allies, we need to make sure that they are well and truly allies.
Michael, to you, what can you see playing out? I know it's moving at pace, everything we're seeing, but can you see a genuine peace plan that is acceptable to both sides and their backers?
Well, yes, I can, and eventually. We have to realize in this moment that we all need to take a deep breath. There is a lot of preconceived notions and anti-Trump rhetoric that expects President Trump to do things that are not in evidence. So we have to set that aside and think through the realities. As Amy said, Americans are willing to spend to win. But to this moment, there has been no demonstrated effort to make Ukraine victorious on the battlefield. So we've just been wasting money for the last 3 years, giving Ukraine enough so that they won't lose, but we haven't empowered them to win. So the president was handed a dog's breakfast when he came into office, and now he's trying to sort it out. This is going to go through many, many iterations, and it's going to take a very long time. And as President Zelensky himself has said, some of the Ukrainian territories will not come back to them soon, but they won't recognize Russian occupation. And eventually, through other means, those Ukrainian territories will be Ukrainian again. So everyone will be involved in shaping the outcome, most importantly, the Ukrainians. The Europeans who have Ukraine as their neighbor need to be very much involved. And that's why we have NATO and the European Union and other organizations, and they will come together over time.
Adam, to you, Keir Starmer has repeatedly mentioned a US backstop as a deterrent to Putin. What would that look like?
Well, I think the point he's trying to make is, and I defer to our military experts, that to have a relatively small military force in Ukraine without the feeling that ultimately, in terms of command and control and surveillance, the US would at least support it, would not be viable. So in one sense, he is expressing a practical reality, and it was an additional qualification on what he initially said about being to put troops in place. But at another level, I think we can clearly see that in asking for a US backstop, the Prime Minister is at least trying to preserve the notion of a Western alliance which approaches problems together, because I think the worry is that we may be going in a different direction. I mean, we've had mention of America's priority of China, which is accepted, and there have been some interesting moves in terms of changing the language in terms of Taiwanese independence from the State Department. But, it should not be forgotten that the UK is also participating in AUKUS, which is fundamentally an alliance, a defensive alliance against China. So obviously what the British want, and I think what the French want and the Poles want, is to continue that alliance. But what it doesn't allow is for the United States to attempt to simply cut off one issue very close to the issue, the concerns of Europeans, and say, we don't want anything to do with it, it's your problem.
Yeah. Sean wants to come in on that.
Yeah, just in terms of numbers, there's been a talk about some sort of force on the ground, peacekeeping, not quite sure how that will work. But literally, conservative estimates talking about 100,000 troops. Now, let's take an example. In the UK, we've got about 75,000 in the British Army. So we almost feel that we're there with us and France and Germany. But when you distill that down, only half our army is actually ready for war fighting. If you're going to do an enduring, you need to have a third of your force deployed, a third preparing to deploy, and a third recovering. So actually, we could probably, as a nation, only put 10,000 of that 100,000 on the ground. Imagine that Germany and France is much the same, 30,000. We're not even halfway there. and two, actually putting a credible force on the ground. And President Zelensky has said 200,000 would be required. Now, this is a harsh reminder, I think, going back to the point that even the UK, that does meet its baseline of funding, has been profiting from 3.5 decades of peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. It's a new world out there. It's a much more dangerous world, and we need to find a way of stepping up. And I think that 100,000 is just a really harsh reminder that we can't do it without more support, potentially, for America.
I mean, we should say that America has also enjoyed a peace dividend. Its defence spending as a proportion of its wealth has gone down as well. So, you know, this sort of notion of putting all the Europeans in the corner is slightly mistaken.
Amy, whatever happens in the coming days and weeks in Ukraine, President Trump's message has landed. Europe needs to up its game.
Europe should not be surprised. This has been, an ongoing conversation that he had on the campaign trail and that he had in his first administration. And so, stepping up to the table, negotiating with the administration, finding points of agreement is what Europe needs to do. They just really need to be truly at the table as partners and allies.
Amy, Michael, Adam and Sean, thank you all so much. No doubt we will be talking about this very shortly again on Roundtable. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.